My husband left me when I was 8 months pregnant. Then he and his mistress came back to the hospital just to laugh in my face, until a powerful man walked in, and his mistress's face turned pale. Before I tell you what happened next, pause for 1 second. If you've ever felt abandoned, replaced, or laughed at when you were at your weakest, stay with me. Subscribe, like, or just stay through the end. I promise, it's worth it. The high-risk maternity ward at Chicago General Hospital was a place of hushed voices and constant vigilance, where every beep of a monitor could signal hope or disaster. I lay in the semi-darkness of room 412, my hand resting protectively on my swollen belly, feeling the occasional flutter of movement that reminded me I wasn't completely alone. Not yet, anyway. The rhythmic beep of the fetal heart monitor provided my only comfort, a steady reassurance that the tiny life inside me was still fighting, still holding on, despite everything that had gone so catastrophically wrong. My name is Isabella Hart, and at 32 years old, I found myself in a situation I never could have imagined during those early, hopeful days of my marriage. 8 months pregnant with my first child, admitted to the hospital with dangerously high blood pressure that threatened both my life and my baby's. I was facing the most terrifying experience of my existence completely alone. The doctors had used frightening terms like severe preeclampsia and immediate risk to mother and fetus when they had admitted me 3 days ago. They monitored me around the clock, adjusting medications, taking blood samples every few hours, watching for any sign that my condition was deteriorating further. But the medical crisis, as serious as it was, wasn't even the worst part of my current nightmare. The worst part was that my husband, Nathan, was gone. I closed my eyes, and instead of seeing the cold hospital ceiling, I saw the small kitchen in the house in Oak Park. On a very different, very distant morning. That morning, I stood in the bathroom, my hand shaking so badly the pregnancy test almost slipped into the sink. 2 red lines appeared faster than I expected, clear in a way that couldn't be denied. I sat down on the cold tile floor for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just held my stomach and whispered one very small sentence. "Mom is here." Nathan was in the kitchen then, fumbling around making coffee. When I walked out, holding the test in my hand, I couldn't say a single word. I just placed it on the table. He looked down. Silence. Then he looked up. His eyes went wide. "Is it real?" His voice cracked. I nodded. And then he did something I still can't forget to this day. He walked over and knelt down in front of me, right in the middle of the kitchen, placed his hand on my belly, pressed his forehead to it like he was talking to a miracle. "Hello, my child," he whispered. "Dad is here." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in front of the laptop, reading everything about pregnancy. He downloaded a fetal development tracking app, then called me over and showed me an illustrated picture of a baby the size of a bean. "Look, babe." He smiled like a child. "It already has a heartbeat." One night, when the pregnancy was bigger, I woke up because my back hurt. Nathan woke up too. He didn't say anything. He just sat up and wrapped his arms around me from behind, placing his hand on my belly like it had become a habit. His hand was warm, steady, familiar. The baby kicked. Both of us felt it. Nathan leaned down, his forehead touching my shoulder, his voice very soft. Not talking to me, talking to the baby. "No matter what happens, I promise, I will never let you and your mom be alone." And I believed him. I believed that promise. I closed my eyes against the harsh fluorescent lights, and the memory of our final confrontation played out behind my eyelids like a horror film I couldn't stop watching. It had been 2 weeks ago, in the home we'd shared for 5 years, the beautiful Victorian house in Oak Park that we'd renovated together with such excitement and hope for our future. I'd found the text messages on his phone, dozens of them, intimate and unmistakably romantic, exchanged with his business partner, a woman named Sienna Brennan. When I'd confronted him with shaking hands, and a heart that felt like it was shattering into a million pieces. He hadn't even bothered to deny it. He'd simply run a hand through his dark hair, his handsome face settling into an expression of weary impatience that made him look like a stranger. "I feel suffocated, Isabella," he'd said, the words landing like physical blows. "This whole situation, the pregnancy, the constant doctor's appointments, your health complications, it's too much. I can't breathe. I need space. I need to get out. I'm 8 months pregnant with your child," I'd whispered, barely able to form the words. "I have a condition that could kill me or our baby. How can you possibly—" "I know what I'm doing sounds terrible," he'd interrupted, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know the timing is awful, but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when I feel like I'm drowning. I need to leave, Isabella. I need to figure out who I am outside of all this." He'd packed a bag that very night while I sat on our bed, too shocked to cry, too devastated to move. He'd walked out the door without looking back, and I hadn't heard from him since. He'd abandoned me when I needed him most, left me to face a high-risk pregnancy and potential medical catastrophe alone. The betrayal cut so deep, I sometimes wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. In the days that followed, as my blood pressure continued to climb despite medication, as the swelling in my hands and feet grew worse, as my obstetrician's expression became increasingly concerned, I'd had to face the possibility that I might die, or that my baby might die, without Nathan ever knowing, without him ever caring enough to check on us. A sharp knock on my hospital room door jolted me out of my spiraling thoughts. I looked up, expecting to see one of the nurses coming to check my vitals again, or adjust my IV drip. Instead, the door swung open to reveal the last person I expected to see. Sienna Brennan stood in my doorway. She was beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that some women achieve through expensive stylists and personal trainers. Her honey blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and she wore a tailored navy blazer over designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over my hospital bed, the IV pole with its bags of medication and fluids, my swollen face and belly, taking in every detail of my misery with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "What are you doing here?" I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse from lack of use. My heart began hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear the monitor beside my bed start to beep faster. "I thought we should have a conversation," she said, her voice bright and conversational, as casual as if we were meeting for coffee. "Woman to woman, you know, to clear the air about a few things. Please leave," I said, my hands instinctively moving to protect my belly as a wave of dizziness washed over me. "I'm not well. This isn't appropriate. You shouldn't be here." She laughed, a short, sharp sound completely devoid of humor, and stepped closer to my bed. Her expensive perfume, something with notes of jasmine and amber, filled the small room, making me feel even more nauseous than I already was. "I know you're not well, Isabella," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss that sent chills down my spine. "Nathan's told me all about your complications. But here's the thing you need to understand. He's not coming back to you. Not now, not ever. He's with me. We're together. We're building a life, and you need to accept that reality and stop clinging to false hope." "I'm not clinging to anything," I said weakly, feeling tears begin to slip down my cheeks, despite my best efforts to remain composed. "He left me. I understand that. I'm just trying to survive and keep my baby alive. That's all I'm focused on." "That thing in your belly isn't going to bring him back," Sienna continued, her voice taking on an even crueler edge as she leaned closer to me. "You probably think the baby is some kind of trump card, some way to keep him tied to you forever. But it's not. It's a burden. It's a chain. And Nathan has finally broken free of you, and all your neediness and medical drama." She was so close now that I could see the cold calculation in her eyes, could feel her breath on my face. "The truth is, Isabella, you're pathetic. You're desperately holding on to a marriage that ended the moment he met me. He chose me over you. He walked away from you when you needed him most because he simply doesn't love you anymore. So why don't you do everyone a favor? Why don't you and that burden you're carrying just disappear from our lives completely?" The cruelty of her words, the deliberate viciousness of her attack on me in my most vulnerable moment, made my vision blur. The monitors beside my bed began beeping more frantically as my blood pressure spiked. I felt a sharp, frightening pain in my abdomen, and I gasped, my hand flying to my stomach. "Step away from her, now!" The voice was not a shout, but it carried such absolute, unquestionable authority that the entire atmosphere in the room seemed to change. It was deep and resonant, vibrating with a power that made even the air feel different. Sienna froze mid-sentence, her smug, cruel expression dissolving instantly into one of shocked confusion. We both turned toward the doorway. A man stood there, and I felt my entire world tilt on its axis. He was tall and commanding, probably in his late 50s, with distinguished gray hair at his temples and an impeccably tailored dark suit that spoke of immense wealth and influence. His face was strong and angular, etched with lines that suggested years of authority and command. But it was his eyes that made my heart stop. They were hazel with flecks of gold, and I knew those eyes. I'd seen them staring back at me from my own mirror my entire life. He looked at Sienna with such cold, piercing intensity that she physically recoiled, taking several stumbling steps backward. Then his gaze moved to me, and his expression transformed into something softer, something that looked almost like wonder mixed with deep, profound pain. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Because I knew this man's face. I'd stared at it 1,000 times over the years, studied it in the single faded photograph my mother had kept hidden in her jewelry box her entire life. The photograph she'd shown me only once, when I was 16 and demanded to know about my father. The man she'd told me had died in a car accident before I was born. The man I'd mourned for someone I'd never known. "You!" I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're supposed to be dead. Get out of this room," the man said to Sienna, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "Get out of this hospital, and if you come anywhere near my daughter again, you will deeply regret it." Sienna, clearly sensing she'd encountered a force far more powerful and dangerous than herself, didn't argue or protest. She grabbed her expensive handbag and practically ran from the room, her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum floor as she fled. The man stepped inside, closing the door behind him with careful precision. His eyes never left my face, and I could see his hands were trembling slightly despite his otherwise composed demeanor. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that seemed barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. "And I'm your father, Isabella. I know you were told I died. I know this must be an impossible shock, but I've been searching for you for more than 30 years. The room began to spin. The revelation, the shock, the sheer impossibility of what was happening combined with my already fragile medical state to create a perfect storm. A sharp, agonizing pain seized my abdomen, spreading through my entire body like fire. The monitors beside my bed erupted in a deafening, continuous alarm that brought nurses running. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Thomas Reed's face. His expression transformed into one of absolute panic as he reached for me. "Nurse!" I heard him roar. "Get a doctor in here now! She's crashing!" When I woke, everything was different. The pain was gone, replaced by a deep, pulling ache in my lower abdomen. I was in a different room, dimly lit, and I could hear the soft whoosh of medical equipment around me. My hand moved instinctively to my belly, and I felt only soft, empty flesh beneath the hospital gown. "Your son is in the NICU," a quiet voice said from beside my bed. "He's small, very small, born at 33 weeks, but he's breathing on his own, and the doctors say he's a fighter." I turned my head slowly, my neck stiff and sore. Thomas Reed sat in the chair beside my bed, looking exhausted but alert. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, and I noticed he was holding something, a photograph, which he set down on the bedside table as our eyes met. "You had an emergency C-section," he explained gently, leaning forward. "The combination of the stress, your blood pressure crisis, and the preeclampsia forced the doctors to deliver the baby immediately. It was touch and go for a while, but you both made it through. You're going to be okay, Isabella." "My baby," I whispered, my voice raw. "I need to see him." "Soon," Thomas promised. "The nurses said they'll bring a wheelchair in an hour so we can take you to see him. He's beautiful, Isabella. He has your eyes." A few hours later, they wheeled me down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear. The NICU wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was too quiet. Rows of glass incubators glowed like small, fragile worlds. Blue and white lights flickered softly over tiny bodies, wrapped in wires and hope. The air smelled of disinfectant, sterile and sharp, clinging to my skin and settling in the back of my throat. When they stopped my wheelchair, I almost couldn't breathe. He was in the third incubator, so small, so impossibly small. His skin was a soft, translucent pink, like dawn trying to break through glass. Tiny tubes rested under his nose. A soft cap covered his head. His chest moved, shallow, fast, but steady, alive. I pressed my fingertips to the glass before I even realized I was moving. "If you'd like," the nurse whispered, "you can open the porthole and touch him." My hands shook so badly, I had to try twice. Click. The small, round door opened with a soft plastic sound. I slid one finger inside. That's when it happened. He moved. His tiny hand, smaller than my thumb, lighter than air, reached out randomly, blindly, and wrapped around my finger. Not tight, not strong, but real, alive, present. I felt something break inside me, or maybe heal. Tears fell onto the plastic edge of the incubator, and I leaned down until my forehead rested lightly against the warm glass. "I'm here," I whispered. He shifted slightly, as if he recognized the sound, or maybe I just wanted to believe he did. "I know this world came too early for you," I said softly. "I know it's loud and cold and full of machines." My thumb barely moved as he held on. "And I know everyone failed you before you even took your first breath." My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. "You are not a burden," I whispered, my lips almost touching the glass. "You are not a mistake." His fingers twitched, tightened. This time it wasn't random. It felt like a choice, like trust. And I felt my heart understand something my mind couldn't explain. "You are not a burden," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You are the reason I live. You are not my burden. You are the reason I live." Behind me, I heard Thomas inhale sharply, but I didn't turn. I didn't need to. At that moment, there was only me and my son, and the quiet, sacred promise forming in the space between us. Whatever it takes, I will stay. We sat in silence for a long moment. I studied this man who claimed to be my father, trying to reconcile his living, breathing presence with the ghost I'd carried in my heart my whole life. "My mother told me you were dead," I finally said. "She showed me one photograph of you and said you died in a car accident before I was born." "Why would she lie to me like that?" Thomas's face contorted with pain. "It's complicated, and I promise I'll explain everything. But the short version is that your mother and I were never married. We had a brief relationship when we were very young. I was 23, she was 21. When she told me she was pregnant, He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "I was an idiot. I was focused on my career, on law school, on building a future. I told her I wasn't ready to be a father. I offered money for an abortion, and when she refused, I walked away. I told her I wanted nothing to do with the baby." He looked at me with such raw regret that it was almost painful to witness. "It was the worst decision of my life, Isabella. The most cowardly, selfish thing I've ever done." Your mother was hurt and angry, rightfully so. She moved away, changed her contact information, and disappeared. I tried to find her a few times in those early years, but not very hard. I was busy building my career, and I convinced myself she was better off without me. "So how did you find me now?" I asked, my mind struggling to process this flood of information. "5 years ago, your mother passed away," Thomas said quietly. "I'd kept a Google alert on her name for years, and when her obituary appeared, I saw it mentioned she had a daughter, you. I hired investigators immediately. It took time to track you down, to confirm you were my daughter. And then I watched from a distance, trying to figure out how to approach you, whether I even had the right to disrupt your life after abandoning you before you were born." He picked up the photograph he'd set down earlier and handed it to me. It was recent, showing me and Nathan at what looked like a charity gala about 6 months ago, before everything had fallen apart. "I've been following your life, Isabella. I knew about your marriage, your career as a graphic designer, your pregnancy. I was trying to find the courage to reach out to you, to introduce myself, when I saw in the society pages that your husband had moved out and was reportedly involved with his business partner." "You read about my humiliation in the newspaper," I said flatly. "I read that my daughter was going through hell, and I couldn't stand by anymore," Thomas corrected firmly. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Isabella. I abandoned you once. I wasn't going to abandon you again. So I hired someone to monitor the situation, to make sure you were safe. When I was informed you'd been admitted to the hospital with pregnancy complications and were here alone, I came immediately. I got here just in time to hear that woman attacking you." Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door, and it swung open. My heart stuttered as Nathan walked in. He looked terrible. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his shirt partially untucked, and his face was pale and drawn. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, darting around the room until they landed on me. Then his gaze moved to the empty space where my pregnant belly had been, and I saw genuine fear flash across his face. "Isabella," he said, his voice breaking. "The baby is the baby." "The baby is alive and in the NICU," Thomas said coldly, standing up and positioning himself between Nathan and my bed like a protective barrier. "No thanks to you or your deplorable behavior." Nathan's eyes finally registered Thomas's presence, and I watched in fascination as his expression shifted from panicked concern to utter, complete horror. All the color drained from his face, and he actually stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe for support. "Mr. Reed?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "Thomas Reed, what are you doing here?" "I'm with my daughter," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "The daughter you abandoned while she was carrying your child. The daughter you left to face a life-threatening medical condition alone." I watched Nathan's legs give out. He collapsed into the visitor's chair near the door, his head falling into his hands. "Oh, God," he moaned. "Oh, God, no! Isabella, you don't understand. You can't possibly understand." "Understand what, Nathan?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the maelstrom of emotions churning inside me. "That you're a cheating coward who abandoned his pregnant wife? I think I understand that perfectly." He looked up at me, and I was shocked to see his eyes were brimming with tears. Nathan never cried. In 5 years of marriage, I'd never seen him shed a single tear. "I had to leave you," he said desperately, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I had to push you away. I had to make you hate me so completely that you'd want nothing to do with me anymore." "What are you talking about?" Thomas demanded, his prosecutor instincts clearly kicking in. Nathan's gaze moved between us, and I could see him making some kind of calculation, weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to deflate, all the fight going out of him. "My company, Brennan Industries, the investment firm I run with Sienna, we've been laundering money, millions of dollars for a criminal enterprise. It's been going on for 2 years, and it's a massive, complex fraud scheme. He pointed a trembling finger at Thomas, his hand shaking so badly he could barely keep it steady. And your office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, is the one leading the federal investigation against us. Your prosecutors have been building a case for the past year. They've been monitoring us, gathering evidence, preparing indictments. My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was saying. Thomas, I was learning, wasn't just my father. He was one of the most powerful federal prosecutors in the entire country, known for taking down corrupt politicians and white-collar criminals. I knew they were closing in, Nathan continued, his voice breaking. I knew arrests were imminent. Sienna and I have been preparing for the worst, trying to protect what assets we could. And then, I realized, if I was still married to you when the indictments came down, they could seize our house, our savings, everything. They could tie you up in the investigation. They could freeze your accounts. You could lose everything because of what I'd done. He looked at me with such desperate, tortured eyes. I thought if I divorced you, if I completely cut you off, if I made you hate me enough to want nothing to do with me, then when the federal agents came, they'd leave you alone. They wouldn't connect you to the criminal enterprise. Your assets would be separate. You and the baby would be protected. So you had an affair, I said slowly, trying to understand. You deliberately had an affair to make me hate you. The affair was already happening, Nathan admitted, shame flooding his face. Sienna and I had gotten involved about a year ago, around the same time the illegal activity started. But yes, when I realized we were about to be caught, I used the affair as the reason to leave you. I made sure you found those text messages. I said the cruelest things I could think of to make you believe I didn't love you anymore. I wanted you to divorce me immediately, to separate your life from mine completely before the arrests. Thomas was staring at Nathan with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between fury and a grudging, reluctant understanding. You destroyed your wife emotionally and abandoned her during a high-risk pregnancy to protect her from the consequences of your own criminal activity, he said slowly. Is that what you're telling me? I know how it sounds, Nathan said miserably. I know there's no excuse for what I've done, not the crimes, not the affair, not the way I handled this. But Isabella, you have to believe me. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped caring about you and our baby. Everything I did, as terrible as it was, I did because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe from the disaster I'd created. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open so hard the thin hospital walls seemed to vibrate. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, their movements sharp, controlled, professional. Behind them, a uniformed police officer stood like a shadow given human form. The air in the room shifted instantly, heavier, colder, final. The man in front reached calmly into his jacket and held up a badge. Gold, solid, unquestionable. Nathan Hart, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You are under arrest. The words landed like a gunshot, not because Nathan didn't expect it, but because he knew this day had always been coming. I watched his hands. They trembled. Not enough to look weak, enough to look human. He stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were finally walking into a future he had already accepted. Metal reached metal. The handcuffs closed around his wrists. Click. The sound cut through the room. Clean, sharp, irreversible. Nathan didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted, and for the first time, they didn't look at the agents. They didn't look at the officer. They looked at me. Not like a man losing his freedom, like a man losing the last piece of his soul. Behind me, I heard Thomas move. His footsteps were calm, controlled. The room felt smaller as he walked closer. He stopped behind Nathan, close enough that Nathan could feel him without turning around. As they began reading him his Miranda rights, Thomas held up a hand. Agents, a word please, in the hallway. The FBI agents looked at each other, then at Thomas. Clearly, they recognized him and understood his authority. They nodded and stepped outside with him, leaving Nathan standing in my hospital room with the uniformed officer watching him carefully. "Isabella," Nathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For the crimes. For the affair. For leaving you. For not being there when you needed me most. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've destroyed any chance we had at happiness. But please believe me when I say I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know any other way to protect you." I looked at my husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, and felt such a complex tangle of emotions I couldn't begin to sort through them all. Betrayal, anger, grief, and underneath it all, a tiny, stubborn ember of the love I'd once felt for him. He'd still cheated on me. He'd still lied to me. He'd still abandoned me in my darkest hour. But he'd done it, in his own twisted, cowardly, desperately misguided way, trying to protect me and our child from the consequences of his own terrible choices. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, honestly. "What you did, all of it, caused so much pain. But I believe you thought you were helping. I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me the truth, to let me make my own choices about how to handle the situation." Thomas returned then, his expression unreadable. He nodded to the FBI agents, who moved forward to handcuff Nathan. "Wait," I said suddenly. "What's going to happen to him?" "That depends on several factors," Thomas said carefully. "The evidence against him is substantial. If he chooses to cooperate with the investigation, to testify against his co-conspirators, and provide information about the criminal organization you were laundering money for, the prosecutors may be willing to recommend a reduced sentence." He looked at Nathan with an expression that was hard and unyielding, but not entirely without compassion. "You're a terrible husband, Nathan Hart. You made catastrophically bad choices that hurt my daughter in ways that may never fully heal. But you are the father of my grandson. So I'm going to give you one chance. Just one. Cooperate fully with the investigation. Tell them everything you know. Plead guilty to your crimes, and accept responsibility for what you've done. If you do that, I'll personally ensure you get the most lenient sentence possible given the circumstances." He stepped closer to Nathan, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "You won't save your career, you won't save your fortune or your reputation, but you might, just possibly, save your soul. And more importantly, you might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship with your son someday. That's the best offer you're going to get." Nathan nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll do it. I'll tell them everything." As the FBI agents led him from the room, Nathan looked back at me one last time. "I love you, Isabella. I know I have no right to say that anymore, but it's true, and I'm so sorry." Then he was gone, and I was left alone with Thomas Reed, the father I'd never known I had. Over the following weeks and months, my life transformed in ways I could never have predicted. Thomas was a constant presence, visiting me every day in the hospital, and then at the comfortable apartment he'd arranged for me after I was discharged. He sat with me during the long hours I spent in the NICU with my son. Our son, he insisted on calling him, watching through the incubator as Caleb fought and grew stronger each day. Slowly, carefully, we began building a relationship. Thomas told me about his life, about how he'd risen from a working-class neighborhood on the South Side to become one of the most respected prosecutors in the country. He told me about his regrets, about the years he'd wasted being too proud and too afraid to track down my mother and make amends. He told me about seeing my face in a photograph for the first time and recognizing his own features staring back at him, about the overwhelming grief of realizing what he'd missed. And I told him about my life, about growing up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support us, about the hole in my heart where a father should have been, about building a career and a marriage that had both seemed so promising before they'd collapsed. The legal proceedings moved forward with brutal speed. Sienna Brennan was arrested the same day as Nathan, caught at O'Hare with 2 suitcases stuffed with cash and a fake passport. She refused every plea deal, screamed at the agents, and swore she would never spend a day behind bars. 9 months later, on the day of her final sentencing, I walked into the federal courtroom, pushing Caleb's stroller. He was almost 10 months old now, healthy, glowing, undeniably beautiful. I had dressed him in pure white cashmere, the soft sunlight catching the golden flecks in his hazel eyes. The moment Sienna looked up from the defendant's table and saw him, something inside her shattered. She lunged across the table, shrieking that the baby should have been hers, that I had stolen her life. Security tackled her to the floor within seconds. Her screams echoed off the marble walls as handcuffs locked around her wrists. I stopped the stroller 3 feet away from where she lay pinned. I bent down, gently removed Caleb's pacifier, and wiped his chin with the corner of his silk blanket. Then I looked straight into her wild, red-rimmed eyes and spoke, softly, calmly, just loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Now you know what it feels like to lose everything, Sienna." The room went dead silent. Even the judge's gavel hung frozen in midair. Sienna stopped fighting. She collapsed, sobbing like a broken child. The judge finally brought the gavel down. 3 sharp, decisive strikes. 23 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Permanent no-contact order with Isabella Hart and her son. I turned the stroller and walked out without looking back. My father was waiting in the corridor. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder as sunlight poured through the tall windows and fell across Caleb's sleeping face. Justice had been served. Cold, legal, and absolute. Nathan, true to his word, cooperated fully. He provided detailed testimony about the money laundering operation, identified the criminal organization they'd been working with, and helped the FBI track down hidden assets. His cooperation led to a dozen additional arrests and the dismantling of a major criminal enterprise. In exchange for his cooperation and his guilty plea, the judge sentenced him to 3 years in a minimum security federal facility. It was far less than he could have received, but it still meant 3 years away from his son, 3 years to contemplate the choices that had led him to this point. 6 months after Caleb was born, I brought him to visit Nathan for the first time. It was awkward and painful, seeing my husband in prison visiting room, wearing the standard khaki uniform, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen him. But when they brought Caleb to him and he held his son for the first time, I saw something in Nathan's eyes that looked like genuine transformation, a recognition of what truly mattered, what he'd risked losing forever. "He's perfect," Nathan whispered, tears streaming down his face as he cradled the baby gently. "He's absolutely perfect, Isabella. Thank you for bringing him. Thank you for giving me this chance." Now, a year later, I sat in the bright, comfortable apartment Thomas had helped me find, rocking Caleb in my arms as sunlight streamed through the windows. My son was healthy and thriving, hitting all his developmental milestones. His hazel eyes, a perfect blend of my eyes and Nathan's, bright with curiosity as he grabbed at everything within reach. Thomas visited almost every day, bringing groceries or just sitting with us, reading the newspaper while Caleb played on his blanket on the floor. He'd stepped down from some of his more demanding cases at work to have more time with his grandson, and I could see the joy it brought him. This second chance at being a father. Nathan called every week from prison, and I accepted his calls, our conversations gradually evolving from stilted and painful to something almost approaching friendship. He would be released in 2 more years with good behavior, and we'd agreed to attend counseling together to see if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship, not for ourselves, but for Caleb. I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive Nathan for the betrayal, for the affair, for the lies. I didn't know if we had any future together beyond co-parenting our son, but I'd learned that life was far more complicated than I'd ever imagined, that people could be both terrible and decent, that love and hate could exist side by side in the same wounded heart. What I did know was that I was no longer alone. I had a father who loved me fiercely, who was trying every day to make up for the years he'd missed. I had a son who filled my life with purpose and joy. I had a small but genuine support system, and I was slowly rebuilding my graphic design career from my home office. The woman who'd laid in that hospital bed a year ago, abandoned and alone, and convinced she might die, felt like a different person now. I'd survived betrayal, medical crisis, the shock of discovering my father was alive, and the complicated reality of Nathan's crimes and motivations. I'd given birth to a premature baby and watched him fight his way to health. I'd learned that families could be found in unexpected places, that forgiveness was a journey rather than a destination, and that strength I never knew I possessed had been inside me all along. As Caleb reached up to grab my finger, his tiny hand wrapping around it with surprising strength, I thought about the future. It wouldn't be the future I'd imagined when I'd married Nathan with such hope and optimism, but it would be mine, built on truth rather than illusions, strengthened by adversity rather than broken by it. And somehow, against all odds, that felt like enough. And if you're listening to this while carrying your own heartbreak, your own shame, your own unanswered questions, I want you to know something. You're not weak, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. If this story helped you feel understood, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who might need it too. I'll be here for the next story.